Mrs. Thatcher was always against it. The rest of the world couldn't make up its collective mind, but did it anyway. I'm talking about sanctions in South Africa. Well, now they're progressively being lifted. Mr. Bush thinks it's time for them to go. The EC ended its ban on investment. Japan has lifted some sanctions, and Australia is willing to wait. Nelson Mandela and the ANC want sanctions to stay until, quote, the job was done, which was supposedly the point of having the sanctions. The job isn't done, but sanctions are disappearing. Was the whole thing a waste of time? Tonight on Crossfire, to discuss the issue, is commentator Alan Jones and Peter Steedman, ex-federal parliamentarian and political activist. Or was it a waste of time?
Certainly not. I think the results are proving themselves, but I think that the current situation is that if you had to take a position to take, I think you'd have to go along with Nelson Mandela. One of the reasons being the government's already gone along with him, and there must be some consistency. And if he's the person that we are seeking advice from or perceiving as someone who's going to play a major role in the new government of South Africa, I think we're obligated to listen to his viewpoint.
Well, Nelson Mandela does have a major role, but I mean, you have to go back to Australia's role here to 1985, where there was a CHOGM, a Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Nassau, and it specified 5 issues that had to be resolved. Firstly, they had to make sure that apartheid was dismantled and there were programs put in action to prove that dismantling. The second thing they said was there's got to be an end to political violence. They said the state of emergency has got to be lifted. Nelson Mandela's got to be released. And the fourth thing they said, you've got to then provide for political freedoms. In other words, unban the ANC. Now, George Bush has simply said, that's all been done. Lift the sanctions. Now, Australia is not doing that. And as a result, it's perpetuating the problems that sanctions have created. What economic sanctions have done is to completely destroy the economic viability of South Africa. And because you're doing that, you're disadvantaging the very people you're trying to protect, namely the blacks. I mean, I've been to Soweto, and pre-sanctions, there were 300,000 houses in Soweto, 100,000 of them with no electricity. Now there are 225,000 and 150,000 have no electricity, no roads. There are 750 schools needed. Now, you can't provide these needs for blacks with an economy that's been destroyed economically. And to suggest that sanctions achieve this, all these changes, is a nonsense.
Do you think you can trust the government of South Africa to change?
I don't think you can trust them totally. I mean, diplomacy is not about trusting people, it's about negotiating the best position. Valent's comment before about sanctions and how it was hurting all the blacks and that, let's just assume for the moment that it may have been even true. Well, why were the blacks and the leadership of the black movements demanding we keep the sanctions on?
Well, I've answered that, Peter. I've answered that because Nelson Mandela understands that the Pan-African Congress, and everyone in Australia in this debate forgets this, the Pan-African Congress may well be more powerful than the ANC. And the Pan-African Congress have a philosophy, a political philosophy. One settler, one bullet. They believe the answer is to completely overthrow the system.
I understand the conspiracy theory concept.
No, that's not a conspiracy theory.
And
that is a fact.
how these things, that's not a fact,
It is a fact.
I'm sorry, it's your conspiracy theory.
And Buthelezi supports free enterprise and a capitalist system. Nelson Mandela actually believes in that too. But he knows that he's governing a black group of people like the Labor Party or the Liberal Party with a whole range of factions. How does he keep them together? He keeps them together by arguing for sanctions but continuing to negotiate with the Klerk.
Well, to get back to Clive's question about whether or not you trust the South African government, I think it's a great breakthrough that the South African government are dismantling parts of apartheid. I think it's a great breakthrough. Many of the things that are happening now, and the Klerk has to be congratulated for that. But Bush jumps in very quickly because Pax Americana and the needs of America aren't necessarily the needs of Australia. And the American economic situation throughout the world, their reliance on the oil fields, the areas of interest that the American goes into and changes their minds very quickly, basically relate to their economic well-being and the trade they can get out of it. We're not exactly in that position, and I think we are taking a far better line. It's been shown up recently when Gareth Evans went over there and received a lot of flack from the South African newspapers and the Melbourne ones who all like to put it up, Gary, which is fair enough. But the basic line was that it was said that he was out of order. And he was out of order because he suggested that monies were being paid or there was an alliance between the South African government and the Zulu movement, which was denied vehemently on television by Dick Beaufort and others, who we saw within the last 2 nights having to back down and say, yes, no, excuse me, just let me finish for a moment, I'll let you go. And the deal is that, yes, they have been paying them. Yes, that they are doing things like that. And even, in fact, the owner of this TV station seems to have had a quid somewhere in there slinging something to the leader. Now, what I'm suggesting with all of that is that, therefore, it is useful to wait and see and to take some advice from both sides and not instantly remove the sanctions because something good is starting to happen. But let's see if they're fair dinkum before we do it.
Well, let me make 2 points about that. Firstly, the reason the negotiations are in place are very simple. And that is the funding source for the ANC in terms of arms and training and money has collapsed. That's Eastern Europe, the Soviet bloc. That's exactly where they were funded. They no longer have a will, a stomach to continue to do that. That has brought the ANC to the negotiating table. The United Nations have urged the ANC to negotiate. And de Klerk had two options. He takes the Tiananmen Square option, where there's people power, and there's tremendous people power in South Africa, black people power, and that's good. You take one option, Tiananmen Square, and shoot them all. He can't do that. Or you take the Eastern European option and allow those people an expression of their will. That is why they're at the negotiating table. Now, to take the point about the support for the South African government of the Zulu movement, let's not take any fancy moral ground. I think that in Australia, the Labor Party, for example, support the trade union movement and the conservation movement, knowing that they in turn will support the government. Now, the reason de Klerk has supported and openly said so now, the Zulu movement, they are a free enterprise movement, they are anti-revolution, and they support the peaceful integration of blacks into the way of life of South Africa. The ANC, the Pan-African Congress, and Zappo don't do that.
I can answer the question why you constantly, and have since the thing started, keep referring to Tiananmen Square, Eastern Europe, communism, and all this thing. The basic things seem to be that the whole thing is some sort of communist front that's organised by these communists or these terrible Eastern European Stalinists or the Chinese Maoists.
Well, don't they exist? Don't they exist?
No, of course they exist, but you bring them.
Well, how many people, how many communists, Peter, are on the executive of the ANC?
I haven't counted them this week, but I'll do that later.
Yes, but the majority of members of the executive of the ANC are communists.
But let's go back to I'd suggest
well,
they're
not.
This
is a fiction.
No,
is communism a fiction?
No, communism is not a fiction, but the way that you're playing the game is in the old, broad brush deal and do everybody.
Well, did communism collapse in Europe or not?
Of course it did, but this isn't the point. No, hang on, I'm not going down this line. You can play that game with yourself later on. What I'm trying to say to you, and what I will say, is that post-Second World War American foreign policy has created half the problems around the world because they, like you, saw a communist under every bed. And when we had genuine nationalists emerging in the countries around the world, rather than support the democratic movements of the nationalists, they rejected them, saying that they were communist fronts. And finally, it's got a lot to do with what you had the way you were arguing. Finally, they pushed these people into the communst bandwagon, and finally, they created what they didn't want. What I'm suggesting is with your situation is, you started speaking about sanctions, and all you have been talking about and this menace behind everything you say. No, hang on.
You
the communists, the Eastern European Stalinists, the Tiananmen Square people. What I'm suggesting is that this is a conspiracy theory.
They funded the ANC.
And it is a part of the myth that you've got.
They funded the ANC.
Of course, there was money put in.
Did Australia fund the ANC?
I'm glad you good, very good. Yes, there's been money.
Did Australia fund Boodle?
Alan, the problem is there's been money coming from a variety. I'm sorry, this isn't your radio program, it's television. In what? You mean on official basis?
Fund Boodle?
Did they give what you mean the same money they gave to the ANC? Yeah. No, they didn't.
Well, why are you whinging about the South African government giving money to Zulu?
I'm not letting you off the hook with the subject. You have been bringing this sort of menace of communism into it all the time, which is your line. Now, but what I'm suggesting to you is that while the communists support many people
in money,
but so
in training, and in arms.
All right, you're not going to.
And they've run out of money training and arms because they've lost their ground in Central Europe.
That is not the basis. All I'm trying to say is that it would be far more useful if you debate the discussion, taking in the variety of nationalist movements, the different black and white groups, and not seeing everything as some leftover bit or the communist threat behind them. Because the reason of the communist threat behind them is the reason they've got nowhere, because it's the official version taken by the Afrikaners.
Well, can I ask the question, re-sanctions? Why should Australia wait? Are we doing any good at all for the cause, or are we just being cautious to make sure the rest of the world is in agreement before we jump on?
No, I think we should wait because we have, and I said rightly or wrongly, it's a matter of political decision, taken advice and supported the ANC with funding as well as anything else. We've been in bed with the ANC, for want of a better word, so it is only fair that we continue to take their advice.
But is our waiting passive or positive?
No, I think the waiting is positive because I think that it's been shown in the last week you can't necessarily trust the South African government, and I think they've got to make a few more concessions before we come out and just follow the American line, which has got to do with America's trade interests, not Australia's. And America's trade interests, by the way, are destroying the Australian rural sector.
At what point should we decide whether to lift them or not? What do we need to put in place?
Well, I think that it's a matter of how the discussions go with the ANC and the other black groupings in South Africa and the government. And when the government shows that it is really moving along the line at a proper rate with the whatever the word is, devolving of the apartheid system and the other things along with it, and we should keep in contact with an ally that we've made, rightly or wrongly, with Nelson Mandela, not necessarily taking his advice all the time, but making our own judgment from the own position of Australian neutrality, autonomy, whatever word you want to use?
3 points need to be made about this. Firstly, we were never in the vanguard, Australia, of sanctions against South Africa. Never. We followed others in trade and sporting sanctions, and we've never abided by sporting sanctions. Johan Crick, the leading South African player, won 2 Australian Open tennis championships here. Sean Thompson has surfed here. Wendy Botha has surfed here. Gary Player's played golf here. What are we talking about? All we sought to do was to blackmail a few major sporting bodies like rugby union and cricket. The second thing is, well, that is hypocrisy, and let's strip it and dismantle it. But the second thing is about sanctions. When they were in place, they have completely ruined aspects of the South African economy, which has cost the black person any kind of dignity at all. If we could abolish everything tomorrow and get the economy going, I repeat, we need 750 schools. We need over 20,000 black teachers. How on earth are we going to get them with an economy which has actively been undermined by the attitude of countries like Australia? The third thing I would make, though, is in relation to should we remove them or shouldn't we? At the moment, Eastern Europe has been emancipated. They're crying out for capital. They're crying out for investment. Now, South Africa is going to miss out on that investment if we don't remove sanctions. Now, in our own instance, I mean, we've just been crawling to Malaysia so that we can secure a trade arrangement. Crawling to Malaysia. We are missing out on vital trade connections with South Africa because we're sticking to a line that the bulk of the Western world, including the European Economic Community and America, don't adhere to.
Can I just go back to that very briefly? Question I ask you, if that's all true, but you say, why were the blacks still asking us for sanctions, and why were they prepared to suffer so much with the sanctions imposed to bring down the blacks?
Some of the
Peter,
blacks.
you see, I'm saying that at the time, at the highest point of anti-apartheid, some of the most outspoken anti-apartheid people in South Africa, including Helen Suzman and others, were saying, for God's sake, no sanctions. You are crippling the economy, which strength we need to be able to save the black South Africans.
Well, I'd suggest that the sanctions are actually brought to the conference table, not your fanciful ideas of cutting off communist money.
Well, I have the
down
ANC.
to the ANC.
Fine, do you think we'll ever know whether the sanctions work the way you say?
They've worked.
No, the thing, as you know, Clive, while we can say these things are happening now, someone in 50 years' time will actually do the economic history of it and give us the
And someone in 60 years will reverse that.
So they've worked, they've destroyed the viability of the South African economy and create a potential whereby 45 to 60% of blacks in South Africa now are unemployed. When we've got an unemployment of 10% in this country, it's critical. 50,000 kids on the streets in this country, and we say it's a crisis. There's millions of black kids on the streets in South Africa. We've got to do something about them, and the only way you can do that is to create an economic strength in South Africa. Sanctions should be off, and we need every conceivable encouragement to black South Africa.
Mr. Steedman, we've got to go.
I didn't realise Alan was on the payroll of the South African government. He's taken over from Norman Banks.
Are you on the payroll of the South African government?
Just to clarify a final point.
No, he's not. Just to pass it on, Peter.
Peter will be disappointed.
Any other message for Peter? Apparently you'll be disappointed. Peter Steedman, Alan Jones, thank you for that discussion. Well, it appears the sanctions might not have worked in the way we